The following is a production of Frank DeFreitas and the Internet Webmuseum of Holography.
Hello, this is Frank DeFreitas, and welcome to another week of HoloTalk for the week of November 1st, 1998. My guest this week is holographic artist Melissa Crenshaw, who will be celebrating 20 years of working with the splendid light in 1999. Melissa currently has an exhibit of her work, both past and present, at the gallery located in Artisan Square on Bowen Island, British Columbia. The gallery is open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and the show runs through November 22nd. Melissa Crenshaw Trivia. Most holography publications mention Canadian artist Melissa Crenshaw, but did you know she was born in Kansas? Here's the HoloTalk interview with Melissa. It runs about 20 minutes. I will not be back on after the interview, so I will thank you now for tuning in, and hope that you will continue to tune in to all of the guests that I have coming on the second season of HoloTalk. Here's Melissa. You've been involved in so many things. You've been involved with holographic production, curating, lecturing, writing, and education. Why don't we just go down that list and talk about some of those things in order?
Okay.
As far as your production, I think some of the listeners might be interested in your work with multiple color reflection holography.
I guess I started to explore the possibilities of color back in the early 80s. I've almost always worked in reflection mode. It's only been this last year that I've started to work in transmission.
Why reflection other than white light transmission or one of the others?
Well, in the early days, I didn't really like the rainbow effect.
Mm-hmm.
It just didn't work with the kinds of images that I was producing. The images that I was producing needed to basically maintain their color from any viewing position.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. And with the rainbow technique, of course, as you change your vertical parallax or your vertical position, the image shifts colors. So that works beautifully for some people's work, but for mine there was no reason for that to happen. So I started to work in reflection mode, and in the early days I just tried experiments using variations in exposure to shift colors slightly, and then I started working with the triethanolamine technique, the swelling technique, which I had to teach myself. And
that's rough, isn't it? At first?
Oh, it's awful.
It's nothing like working on a piece for a couple days and then find out you've got this blue streak going down the middle of it.
Oh, yeah, mini blue streaks. There's a lot of holograms that could have gone into edition that ended up going into the trash because there was a 1-inch by 8-inch blue streak on the left side down by the bottom. I mean, it's almost painful, that that technique, but it was the only way to do color. It still is the only way to do color unless you have 3 lasers and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So I just did it. And the early work I was doing then I was really excited about the Russian constructivist work from the early part of the century, and there was a lot of that work being exhibited, and I was actually exploring geometric shapes and the same kind of spatial relationships that the constructivists were actually looking at. And, color reflection holography was a great way to do that.
Did you work directly with the reflection hologram itself, or did you shoot masters first and then do transfers?
No, in the beginning, back in the early 80s, I did a lot of single beam reflection work. I mean, it was optically it was the simplest technique you could do.
Yeah.
And I put all of the complication, if you like, into the color technique. There's only a few of us that have actually worked with that very simple optical technique, and it's too bad because there's a type of image and there are things you can do with a single beam reflection hologram that you really can't do with a multiple beam. So I did that for a few years, and then I started working multiple beam, but still not using a master.
Yes.
And then in the mid-'80s, I started working with masters.
How did you ever manage? Did you come up with a special technique that you could let the listeners know about? Because I know a lot of people like to try this triethanolamine.
Okay.
You can't go through holography without giving that a shot. How did you come about where you got it down to the fact that you knew that you weren't going to get any streaking on the plate?
Well,
did you ever work that out?
Did.
Okay.
But it's very much trial and error and to get your own individual technique. In terms of the shooting geometry and the pre-swelling, The best paper is probably still the very early paper by Lon Moore and Steve McGrew from the 1982 International Symposium papers from Lake Forest. That explains it. Steve McGrew then produced a paper showing a graphical method whereby you could actually lay the optics out on graph paper and know how to do your angle changes and things, which are critical for color control. That's an excellent paper to explain that. And the rest of it is just trial and error. I mean, I basically soaked the plate in triethanolamine, and I would squeegee the surface of it very carefully, wash the back of the glass, let the thing dry for 3 hours, shoot it, and see what happens.
Yeah.
Color mixing is very tricky, but you can, you just keep experimenting. It's an RGB color mixing process. So
very similar to a monitor on a computer.
I guess so. Yeah. Is that RGB? Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's light. It's light mixing. It's additive colors.
And then later on, toward the mid to late 80s, you were working with Sidney Dinsmore.
Oh yes. Sidney came to me in 1986. In 85 and 86 both, I worked in China. I worked in Beijing, and in 86 I was directing a very large international exhibition there, and I needed an assistant curator, and I hired Sid. We didn't even know each other at that point, and we ended up sitting in this little tiny room in China together for 6 weeks and came out of it best friends. And she asked me then to do a collaborative project with her, and that project ended up lasting 7 years. And we ended up collaborating until she moved to Hong Kong. She moved to Hong Kong to get married and have a family. So that was a wonderful collaboration, and we produced figurative works. She had some Canada Council grants. We were able to go to Germany and work with Fred Untis there and shoot Pulse Masters. And we also worked with Hans Bierkelgen in Chicago shooting Pulse Masters. And we generated a number of series, and we were very successful with that work. We actually made a real living with that work. Yeah.
As far as your curating, you've also curated a number of different shows over the years. Here in North America and Canada, and also in Europe, I imagine, and China itself, didn't you?
Mainly the two that were in China, and then in Canada, Sydney was a curator also, and I assisted her on a couple of shows, in particular Images in Time and Space, where I was sort of the lighting specialist for that very large exhibition. I directed the exhibitions in Beijing, 2 of them, a small one and then one in association with an international conference in 86. And then I did the big 1988 Lake Forest International Symposium exhibition in Chicago. That was a really big show. That was really fun.
Were you involved with the publication Wavefront?
Oh, yes. I did just photography for that journal for a few years, and then the last issue, which we called the Recession Special, was actually produced by Al Rizudis and myself, and it was a bit of a spoof. Everything was so dreadful then with the museum closing and the market and art crashing. We decided we needed to do something to liven people's spirits up, so we produced a bit of a spoof issue, and that was really quite fun.
How many issues total for Wavefront?
Oh, boy, I don't even know. Maybe there were 10 or something.
Okay, I believe
it was mostly Burns Simpson and Al Rizudis that did the work on Wavefront, but it did come out of Vancouver. I just did photography for them.
A beautiful publication.
Pardon me?
A beautiful publication.
Oh, it was a wonderful journal. I mean, it was, it had a real artist slant. It was very non-commercial. And, of course, everybody's pockets got empty doing it. But it would be wonderful to start that up again, especially on the Internet, which is quite possible, because Al's real involved now in HTML language and stuff.
Yeah.
So.
I don't believe there are any publications on holography anymore, are there?
The only one I know of is the Holography Business News that Lancaster started. Yeah. That still comes out. That's pretty much aimed at the embossing industry, though, but there is no... but at one time we had 3 journals, and we don't have the kind of comprehensive holosphere or wavefront journal now that covers the whole industry, which is a real shame.
What about your lecturing?
Haven't done any of that in a while, but I was very fortunate in that because I did a lot of the early color work in holography, people wanted to know about it, and I was brought in to lecture at various places. I did workshops and lectures again in Beijing. That was the Institute for Post and Telecommunications.
Mm-hmm.
I lectured in MIT once. I lectured at the University of Mississippi. I've done various lectures for galleries and museums. And that's always kind of fun. You know, you get free plane tickets.
Yeah. Do you still do that? Travel around and speak?
Not too much. The last couple of years I've been working for an engineering company here that develops photonic switches. I bought a house. I needed to kind of, concentrate on, earning a living for a while. The last big conference and lecture I did was the Nottingham conference in England 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's called the International Conference on Art Holography.
Yes.
Peppers Conference.
Yes. And there's actually a site on the web for that as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What was it like making your first hologram? Why even get involved with that, and how did you get involved with it? That goes back to what, 78, 79?
79, yeah. I was a social worker in the 70s. I lived in Chicago. I did a lot of, I worked for HUD agencies. I did a lot of street social work, emergency services. And I took a year off because I got very burnt out.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'll just study film or something, right, for fun. And then I found out about holography. I had been reading about Carl Pribram's theory on the holographic mind.
Yes, a Stanford neurosurgeon.
He was a neurophysiologist, I think,
yes,
and had some very fascinating papers on using the hologram as a model for understanding how the neural networks and things operate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, that's really neat. And then I found out that there was actually a place in Chicago that taught and displayed real holograms. So I went there, and I immediately signed up for class. That was Lauren Billings' place.
Do you remember who was?
Chicago Museum of Holography.
Do you remember who was teaching back then? There.
It was John Hoffman.
Okay.
And it was an amazing time because in my class I had Doug Tyler, Ed Wesley, and Steve Smith.
No kidding. Wow.
And Tom Spekovich and Ed Dietrich had just graduated with the class before mine. So it was a real hotbed of holography at that time. It was wonderful. It taught really good basic techniques. So a lot of people got a good foundation there.
And how did it feel when you saw your first hologram?
Oh, I thought it was incredible. I couldn't believe it. I did a little tiny 2-inch by 2-inch laser transmission image of a ribbon curled.
Mm-hmm.
It was a sand table, and the curled ribbon went back about 20 inches.
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
Yeah, and it was a little late, and you had to use a laser to see it.
Yeah.
I guess I was hooked at that point.
Well, I love it.
Apparently, I was hooked at that point.
I love laser transmission holograms.
Me too.
I love them.
Yeah, they're amazing. I mean, talk about data storage. I've got some Pulse Masters that were shot. There's one that Michael Page shot for me for a commercial job, and you can see the entire inside of the room where we shot the master.
Wow.
It's just incredible. You can see the clock on the wall like 15 feet away. Like, it's just unbelievable.
Have you ever had a holographic portrait done of yourself?
Well, not really. I model for some of the holograms that Sid and I did. We both took turns modeling. So they're not really of me.
Yeah, I meant more like a formal sitting. Like, this is Melissa Crenshaw that someone 100, 200 years in the future can look back at.
Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, the work I just installed a show here on the island where I live, and there are actually 2 images of me that it's quite obvious that it is of me.
Mm-hmm.
They're not portraits of Melissa. They have other titles. I'm just a person in there. But, yeah, definitely somebody could look at that someday and go, and that was the artist. Yeah, when she was really young.
Yeah, I would like to see it happen where most of the people who were involved with the field of holography have portraits done for future generations to look back on.
Yeah, it would have made a lot of sense, huh?
You know? Yeah.
Have that kind of an archive.
You're involved with education now at a physics department.
Well, sort of. What I really am is I'm called a physics research associate, and it was a wonderful opportunity. I had to close my studio in Kitsilano. I had to find a new place for it, and Bern Simpson, who's been involved in holography for a long, long time, arranged for me to move my entire optical system into the physics department at Cap College, and they brought me in as a research associate. So I don't actually teach, although the lab's available for demonstrations if we need it.
Mm-hmm.
But mainly I just have the opportunity to go there whenever I want and work on the kind of research we're working on now, is to hook up the computer animation and video system, through the LCD screen and to do holographic transfers of that kind of information. So
you're doing some work with your older postmasters from the 80s as well?
I am, yes. This show that I just opened has there's about 10 new images, but I've got 3 on display. And I did a few experimental masters when Sid and I shot the pulse masters for our work, and I'm using those now, which is kind of neat. And I'm doing just open aperture achromat transfers, which are real neat. They make a black and white image close to the film plane. And then, of course, as you move off the film plane, the whole thing just explodes into spectral color.
Wow.
It's sort of a breaking the rules technique.
Why don't you let the listeners know about the show, when it opens, how long it's running, where it's located, in case anyone from your area happens to log on and they're listening to this.
Yeah, it's just a small show. I live on an island. I live on Bowen Island, which is just 20 minutes from the mainland where Vancouver, British Columbia is. So I live near a huge city, but this is a wonderful little island. It's a lot of artists live here. And we have a local gallery called just the Gallery at Artisan Square. And that show's open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays through November 22nd. And I've got some of Sid's work and mine, and I've got some early abstract pieces. I've got some of the Z-axis pedestal abstract pieces from the early 80s, and then I've got 3 of the new pieces.
For school-age children who may be listening right now, we get a lot of educators and students that come onto the site and listen. What tips would you give them, or advice, if they would want to get involved with holography, and especially that you're a woman working in the field, what would you say to some of the female student listeners about getting involved with science and technology and art and technology? What have some of your experiences been in the past? Has things changed for you, and what do you see happening in the future with it?
Well, I think one of the beautiful things about holography is that it opens a door for basically rather non-technical people, which I would have considered myself before I did holography. It opens the door to artistic people. It opens the door to sort of non-mathematical people. It opens the door into a world that is used to just be the domain of physics, essentially, and science. And that's a really wonderful thing. Holography provides a bridge between the creative world of image making and, the world of physics and science. And to be able to cross that bridge and go back and forth between those two worlds is a really wonderful thing to be able to do. And I think that it's interesting that when I was, younger, like 20 years ago, there weren't a lot of women still going into science and physics. And yet this interesting thing happened in holography, which is that I would almost stick my neck out and say that the majority of art holographers were women. Somehow it was like here was an opportunity for women to get involved in imaging that involved technology, and they just jumped at the chance and became excellent. I mean, some of the best holographers in the world are women. So go for it. It's not a backup career like house painting.
My daughter has a physics professor who I found out was a student that I had, a young lady that I had in one of my holography classes.
Oh, wow.
Back in the early 80s.
That's
and she
great.
found it so fascinating that she kept reading books about it and decided to study physics. Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's really great. I mean, anything that opens a door for you, and the more doors you have open for you, the more interesting your life is going to be. And holography just, it covers so many different areas. It's really great that way.
Now, you had your own lab. You didn't rent facilities, right?
No, I never had to. I've always been extremely lucky about labs.
Did you work with a sand table system, or did you have the...
Oh, yes. I worked with everything. I started out at the school in Chicago, and we were able to rent for $1 an hour.
No
to
kidding.
set up labs on the weekends, which I did. Then I moved to Seattle, and I had a Bachelor of Science degree at that point, and I wanted to get my Bachelor of Arts, so I went to a small state college called Evergreen State College, which just happened to have a fabulous holography lab that no one ever used. They had a 50 milliwatt helium neon laser. They had an NRC optics table. I just couldn't believe it.
Just sitting there.
Huh?
Just sitting there.
Just sitting there waiting for me. So I went to school there and got my Bachelor of Arts, and then I ended up teaching holography there for a year. And I basically had that place to myself. And then Global Images wanted to set up a lab in Vancouver and have an artist-in-residence program, so they hired me to design the lab and design the optics and to sort of run that program. And I did. And when I came here to do my 4-month artist-in-residence, I never left. And Walter Clark owned Global Images, and he ended up going to New York and then, I believe, London to run his embossing business, and I ended up owning the lab.
Wow.
I know, it was just amazing. So then the next thing that happened was that I thought I was going to have to close the lab and mothball all the equipment and everything, and then all of a sudden Bryn Simpson came to me and said, how would you like to move it to Cal College? So I've been really lucky that way, just really lucky. I've always had equipment.
So you're basically working on not necessarily a Newport table, but one of the production tables now, I would imagine, right?
Well, in my old facility, I had a homemade table, if you like. It was a 7,000-pound concrete and steel number.
Wow. But
when we moved into Cap College, Holographic, a very successful dichromate company here, donated a 5-by-10-foot NRC table.
Wow.
So, yeah, I've just been really lucky that way.
Let me ask you this. You've worked on both systems, or a number of different systems. I'm speaking specifically of tables. Sand tables, you've got that concrete and steel table that you just mentioned, and the Newport. If the homemade, I'll call them homemade for lack of a better term, table is well constructed, do you really notice that much of a difference in the end result?
Absolutely not.
There you go, folks.
My optics table we built for $1,000 at the lab, and it worked like a charm. It was beautiful. And I must honestly say that I can't tell, the table I'm working on now, if I had to go out and buy it new, it would cost about $25,000. I can't possibly even imagine in a million years that there's that much of a difference between the two.
Yeah.
I mean, you just learn. I mean, I've built everything. I mean, I've built all my optical holders, my components, my frame holders, and everything. Very little off the shelf ever ends up in my lab because of money. But that's okay,
Well, Melissa, do you have any closing comments or remarks you'd like to say before we close out the show?
I don't know. Hello to everybody. And mainly just that, I think a lot of us had a bit of a rough time there when the museum closed and when the publications went under and people stopped collecting. But it's great to know that people are still doing the work, and it's a wonderful field and it should continue.
Amateur and hobbyist holography is still fairly strong.
Oh, yes, I think so.
And
that's great.
Which
That's
is
where
nice.
it started.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, Melissa, thank you very much for being on the show.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
And don't forget to tune in sometime during the week. This will go up on Sunday night around midnight, and then it will be up for a week.
Okay.
Well, Melissa, nice talking.